right and left with his heavy axe. His followers pressed after him, and after hard fighting cut their way through their opponents. Again and again the maneuver was repeated, the resistance of the Arabs weakening, as most of their best men had fallen, while the large shields carried by the horsemen repelled the greater part of the missiles they hurled at them. Another minute or two and the Arabs broke and fled from the hills, leaving over 20 of their number on the ground, in addition to the whole of their mounted men. Jethro had now time to look round, and saw for the first time that he had not, as he supposed, been engaged with the whole of the enemy's party. While some 50 of them had attacked him, the rest had made direct for the camels, and were now gathered in a mass around them. With a shout to his men to follow him Jethro galloped at full speed toward the Arabs, and with a shout flung himself upon them, clearing his way through them with his axe. He was but just in time. A desperate conflict was raging across the camels. At one point several of the Arabs had broken into the square, and these were opposed by Amuba, Chebron, and one of the men, while the others still held back the Arabs on the other side. The arrival of Jethro, followed closely by the rest of his men, instantly put a stop to the conflict. The Arabs no longer thought of attacking, but with cries of dismay started for the hills, hotly pursued by the horsemen, who followed them until they reached the foot of the rocks. As soon as the Arabs gained their fastnesses they again betook themselves to their slings, and the horsemen fell back to the camels. Jethro had not joined in the pursuit, but as soon as the Arabs fled had leaped from his horse. "You were almost too late, Jethro," Amuba said. "I was indeed," Jethro replied. "I thought that I was engaged with the whole of the footmen, and in the heat of the fight did not notice that a party had moved off to attack you. You are terribly hurt, I fear, both you and Chebron. Are both the girls unharmed?" Mysa and Ruth had both risen to their feet as soon as the attack ceased. "We are both safe," Mysa replied; "but oh, how terribly you are hurt, both of you, and Jethro too is wounded."
"My wound is nothing," Jethro said. "Let us look to those of Chebron first,"
for Chebron had sat down against one of the camels. "Do not be alarmed," Chebron said faintly. "I think it is only loss of blood. My shield covered my body."
"Now, girls," Jethro said, "do you get beyond the camels, open one of the bales of cloth, and set to work tearing it up in strips for bandages. I will look after these two." After an examination of their wounds Jethro was able to say that he did not think that any of them would have very serious consequences. Both had been wounded in the leg with javelins, the side of Chebron's face was laid open by a sword cut, and a spear had cut through the flesh and grazed the ribs on the right side. Amuba's most serious wound had been inflicted by a javelin thrown at him sideways. This had passed completely through his back under both shoulder blades and had broken off there. Jethro cut off the ragged end, and taking hold of the point protruding behind the left arm, drew the shaft through. Then taking some of the bandages from the girls, he bound up all the wounds, and then proceeded to examine those of the men who were already occupied in stanching the flow of blood from their comrades' wounds. It was found that one of the defenders of the square was dead and 3 others severely wounded. Of Jethro's party 2 had fallen and all had received wounds more or less severe. Had it not been for the shields that covered their bodies few would have emerged alive from the conflict, but these gave them an immense advantage over the Arabs, who carried no such means of protection. The owner of the camels had escaped unhurt, having remained during the fight hidden under some bales. As soon as the wounds were all bandaged and a drink of wine and water had been served out to each, the camels were unbound and permitted to rise. 3 of the men most seriously wounded, being unable to sit on their horses, were placed on the bales carried by camels, and the party again set out. It was well that they were obliged to proceed at the pace of the camels, for several men could scarcely sit their horses, and could not have done so at a pace exceeding a walk. "Now, Amuba, let us hear about your fight," Jethro said. "I have not had time to ask a question yet."
"There is naught to tell," Amuba said. "We saw you charge down upon their horsemen and destroy them, and then ride into the middle of their foot. At once a party of about 30 strong detached themselves and made straight for us. As soon as they came within range of our arrows we began. I shot 4 before they reached us, and I think Chebron did the same; but the men with us shot but poorly, and I do not think that they can have killed more than 7 or 8 between them. However, altogether that accounted for about half their number, and there were only about 15 who got up to a hand-to-hand fight with us." For a bit, aided by our breastwork, we kept them out, but at last they managed to spring over, and although we were doing our best and several of them had fallen, we had been wounded, and it would have gone very hard with us in another minute or two if you had not come up to the rescue. Now let us hear what you were doing." Jethro then described the encounter he and his party had had with the footmen.
"They fight well, these Arabs," he said, "and it was well for us that we all carried shields, for had we not done so they would have riddled us with their javelins. As you see, I had a narrow escape, for had that dart that went through my ear been an inch or two to the right it would have pierced my eye. I have 2 or 3 nasty gashes with their swords on the legs, and I think that most of the other men came out worse than I did. It was lucky that they did not strike at the horses, but I suppose they wanted them, and so avoided inflicting injury on them. However, it has been a tough fight, and we are well out of it. I hope I shall not be called on to use my battle axe again until I am fighting in the ranks of the Rebu."
End of chapter 18.